Welcome to In-Depth with Yosef G, a bi-weekly program at UMD Media. In today's topic, our main question will be, what does the US want in the Ethio-Tigray war? The riddle in the Tigray war has been not, I underline, not what does Ethiopia want, what does Eritrea want, what does Amhara want, or even what does Tigray want. In all of these cases, the goal is rather clear. When it comes to Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Amhara, the three partners in crime, their ultimate goals might differ, but they do agree on the immediate goal, which is the total destruction of Tigray through war, siege, and genocide. For this trio, there is absolutely no ambiguity as to what they want. It is the vanquishing of Tigray through war and genocide. That is, if they can get away with it. So is it with the TPLF. The TPLF also knows what it wants. It wants to end the siege that has been laid on the people of Tigray for almost 2 years now. It wants to end the genocide of Tigray through war, famine, and disease. What remains the riddle is, what is it exactly that the US wants in regard to this war? What has become a determining factor in the outcome of this war? Well, we'll look at it below. And now let's look at the US position in regard to the ongoing siege of Tigray. Strangely enough, the US has been rather comfortable with the status quo, with the ongoing siege of Tigray. It doesn't seem to have bothered it that much. In fact, so far as some food aid keeps on trickling into Tigray, that is on and off, it's as if the US wants this to continue for a while until it finds a lasting solution. That's according to the US. It has found it, in fact, an ideal from which to conduct a peace negotiation between Ethiopia and Tigray. It has felt that if a compromise is to be reached between the government of Abiy and the Tigray leadership, it's only by holding Tigray hostage. For the US then, the siege of Tigray has turned out to be a necessary precondition for the peace settlement. And that's not all, because if that is true, if the US has found it necessary for this precondition to exist, then it won't be simply the case of the US exploiting the siege of Tigray that has been brought by circumstances not of its own, but also that it will have to actively maintain that status quo until a peaceful solution is to be found. For example, if you have looked at the latest response to the recent eruption of war in Ethiopia, the US response has been to Tigray, go back to your encirclement. Return to Tigray. Literally what that means is go back to your siege. That is the point from which we'll find a peaceful settlement to this crisis. That has been the message of the United States. Now it would be interesting to see how the United States has been actively maintaining the ongoing siege of Tigray. As pointed above, the US has not only been comfortable with the ongoing siege of Tigray, but it has also been actively maintaining it for obvious reasons. It feels that if the siege is lifted prematurely, now prematurely in quotation marks, then the TPLF leadership would not be amenable to the kind of peace settlement that the US has in mind. We'll look at what that peace settlement looks like later. There are three ways that the siege of Tigray could be broken. We could look at that by simply looking at the map. Southwards, if the TDF is able to march all the way to Addis Ababa and topple the Abiy government, or if it marches all the way to Asmara and topple the Isaias government, or if it manages to reach Sudan by occupying Western Tigray, then in all the three ways, in any one of them, if it succeeds in any one of them, the siege of Tigray would be broken. Now, what I am insisting is that the United States wouldn't be happy if any of those marches succeeds prior to a peace settlement. Now, let's first look at the first one, the march to Addis Ababa. In fact, that's exactly what happened when the TDF tried to go all the way to Addis Ababa a few months back. If it had succeeded reaching Addis Ababa, then it's obvious that with regime change in Addis Ababa, the siege of Tigray would have come to an end. But the US was totally and adamantly, against it. It only tolerated the TDF march so far as it was not a threat to the capital city. It gave the TPLF leadership a warning, a red line that they shouldn't pass. But the Tigrayan leadership thought that it was bluffing. But it was not bluffing. As soon as they reached Debre Birhan, two things happened. First, the United States gave green light to its Middle Eastern allies, namely the United Arab Emirates and Turkey, which unleashed fleets of drones against the TDF. The second one was it made clear to the TPLF leadership that even if they reached Addis Ababa, it will go against them. In other words, it will make it ungovernable. For these two and other reasons, the TDF was forced to retreat and march all the way back to Meghaleh. In other words, what happened was the first attempt to break the siege of Tigray was unsuccessful because the US wanted to maintain that siege. Now, for the second one, let's look at Western Tigray. At the beginning of the war, the US stance on Western Tigray was clear and just. After noticing that an ethnic cleansing of huge proportions was taking place, with village after village, many villages, being emptied of their Tigrayan populations, with tens of thousands of them fleeing to Sudan, with more than 1 million displaced and forced to flee to the interior of Tigray and live in displacement camps. And at the same time, after looking at the plains of Western Tigray, turning out to be probably the greatest killing fields in this war, Then the US did the right thing at that time. It insisted, it wanted all the genocidal forces occupying West Tigray to leave the land, namely Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Amhara forces. It felt that if this murderous group are not forced to move out from Western Tigray, that the genocide of the Tigrayan population in Western Tigray will go on. But what happened was amazing. This stand didn't last long for two reasons. Two entities that are very close to the United States advised against it. They advised the United States not to insist the removal of these murderous forces from Western Tigray for various reasons, out of which the biggest ones are, there are two reasons. One of those entities is the EU, the European Union, which felt that if the Western Tigray comes under the occupation of Tigrayan forces, of TDF, then the possibility of hundreds of thousands of Tigrayan refugees making it all the way to Sudan is huge. Not only that, what it was mainly concerned was that out of those hundreds of thousands or a million of them, tens of thousands of them might be able to make it all the way to Europe. And that was its main concern. It felt that the only way this could be prevented was by leaving those genocidal forces in Western Tigray. The other entity, the other probably a cruel entity, was the ICG, the International Crisis Group, which also advised both the EU and the US not to insist for the removal of the genocidal forces from Western Tigray. And their reason has to do dual. They have a dual reason. One was, of course, the refugee problem that I mentioned. The other one was Ethiopia's unity. They are good that if the Ethiopian forces and the Amhara forces leave Western Tigray, then that would be the beginning of the disintegration of Ethiopia. Because they said that Tigray might insist on separation from Ethiopia. So according to their distorted mind, they felt that in order to keep the unity of Ethiopia, the siege of Tigray, and thereby the genocide of Tigray has to go on. That is, they felt that that is the smaller price to pay for the stability of Ethiopia. And the United States bought that argument. It suddenly and completely stopped talking about West Tigray, even as the killings, as the genocide went on unabated up to this day. That's why, even as it mentions Western Tigray, it only demands nowadays for Eritrean forces to leave that area. And even then, it is said with no force of conviction, which brings us to the third road for breaking the siege of Tigray, the road to Asmara. Now, at the beginning of the war, the Trump administration was openly cheerleading the Abiy government. In fact, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Tiber Nagy, notoriously claimed that Tigray was trying to internationalize the war. They condemned Tigray for attacking Eritrea, which is, totally absurd. Now, in retrospect, you could see that it was just the opposite that was happening. But nevertheless, that was how the Trump administration reacted at that time. With the Biden administration occupying the White House, we felt that things would change. But we got it wrong. There was a change of tone at the beginning, which was welcome, But when it comes to the strategy, it remains the same. Now, it also makes logical sense. If the US siege strategy is to work, it will necessarily need Eritrea to block the northern road. In a various ways, and you could see that implicitly the support of Eritrea is needed in making the US siege strategy against Tigray to work. Let me put it this way. It is not any one exit or any one road in particular that the United States is opposing. The US is opposing any road that would break the siege. If that is so, then we could understand that it would oppose the northern exit. So we could see now the complete picture on how the United States has been actively working to maintain the ongoing siege of Tigray. So why is the US insisting on the siege strategy? Well, if we are to be charitable in our interpretation, then we could say that the US is genuinely trying to find a compromise between the Abiy government and the Tigray leadership. But the problem with this is that it is an impossible compromise. There has never been a compromise between a genocider and its victims, especially as the genocide is still going on. What kind of a compromise could come up? Have a genocide, maybe? There has been no precedence of any such an attempt. In all previous cases of genocides, either a genocider wins or its victims win. So, in a just world, either you try to get rid of the genocider, as it has happened, for example, in the case of Rwanda, or even in the case of Germany, when Hitler was eliminated, even though it was after the fact, or you end up, if there is a stalemate between the genocider and its victims, as is the case now in Ethiopia, between the Ethiopian and its allied forces and Tigray. Then you try to separate them. A good example of that would be the Darfur case in Sudan, where the United Nations peacekeeping forces were put in between the two, because no compromise could be reached between the two. Even though it was half successful, that was what was done. So you either get rid of the genocider, which means you get rid of Abiy, or you end up separating the two, even as two nations if that's necessary to stop the genocide. But the idea of trying to convince a genocider to stop or even reduce his genocide, as I said above, cynically, maybe have a genocide, so that you could end up in a political settlement that would leave him secure in the seat of power as a prime minister. That would be pure insanity. That is why the US, the EU, the UN cleverly are reluctant to admit that a genocide is taking place in Tigray. Because the moment they admit that, then they would know that the compromise that they are proposing would be impossible to propose without the whole world looking at it for what it is. So why does the US want to bail the grand genocider Abiy? That is probably the million-dollar question that we have to look at. Well, there are three reasons. The first one is it has found Abiy indispensable for Ethiopia's unity. Crazy as that it might seem, it doesn't see any alternative to Abiy right at this moment. Even though it is in the 4 years of Abiy that Ethiopia has been disintegrating. As all kinds of dictators and totalitarian leaders, they make themselves indispensable by eliminating any other alternative in the land. That's exactly what Abiy has been doing. And this, instead of being a warning to the US, all that it sees now is that if they take out Abiy, or if a regime change takes place in Ethiopia, there would be no other alternative that would hold Ethiopia together. That is according to the US. That's number one. The second one is Abiy has turned out to be a neoliberal darling because he's willing to sell anything of worth in the country, be it land, telecom, airlines, industrial parks, and now his latest move is the banks. As a result of that, the neoliberal order has been reluctant to keep up on Abiy, even after all the crimes that he has been committing. The last one is interesting, the third one. It has to do with Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has solidified Abiy's indispensability to the West. Now that they are competing with China and Russia for the heart of Africa, they feel, especially the United States feels, that one of the main ways to hold on the African nations is to woo the African nations is through Addis Ababa. Addis Ababa being the seat of the African Union. It feels that at this point in time, the US feels that it cannot afford to antagonize Ethiopia, even if it takes a genocide or a siege to appease the Ethiopian government. So it's amazing. Now we could look at the cruelty of it. For the sake of Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans die. So that is something that's the price that the United States is willing to take. In conclusion, let's ask the same question in a different way. The same question, the topic of the day, which was, what does the US want in the Ethio-Tigray war? Now, let me put this way, in a more recent way. What does the special envoy for the Horn of Africa, Mike Hammer, want? We know that Mike Hammer is now in Addis Ababa, and he's trying to find a solution to the crisis, the new war that has emerged, that has erupted again in between Ethiopia and Tigray. Now, if he is coming back to simply repeat what the State Department has said, return to Tigray after this huge assault, after tens of thousands of soldiers have been killed, and thousands of them have been taken prisoners, and the war is ferociously going on in all fronts. If the only thing that the US has to say is return to Tigray, that would amount between inanity, or call it silliness or stupidity, and cruelty. The US has to seriously ask, what do they have to offer Tigray this time? They can't have it both ways. There is no such compromise. They have to realize that there is no such compromise between a genocider and those people are the victims of that genocide. Either they will have to let go of Abiy, by that seek regime change in Addis Ababa, and have a new government that accommodates Tigray in many ways, that the people of Tigray have been asking, or if they are unwilling or unable to do that, then they should let go of Tigray. You cannot have it both ways. It's either Abiy or Tigray. Therefore, if they are really serious for both political and humanitarian reasons, this siege has to come to an end. And the only way they could do it at this point in time with the least cost is if they insist on Western Tigray to be returned to Tigray. With that move only, the war would come to a halt. The Isaias regime in Eritrea would again be isolated because the only way it connects with its allies in Amhara is through Western Tigray. So if that is cut off, then Eritrea will remain isolated as it used to be before. The Amharas would give up on their dream of expanding or extending their territory to Tigray. And whoever comes in Addis Ababa, whoever leader is in Addis Ababa, would be free of the influences of the Amhara leaders and the Asmara leadership. So if the Americans are really serious about bringing peace in the Horn of Africa, the only way to that peace is through Western Tigray. And that is what should be done. Thank you. I doubt that it will be done, by the way, but that's what it should be done if they really want an lasting peace in our region. Thank you.